to follow. Words and the way we use them, like our hands and other tools and our voices, can help or harm. Words and language matter. We know they can be used to inflict or repair harm and conflict and division. They can be used to destroy or create healing, reconciliation, and peace. George Lakoff is a cognitive science and linguistics scholar. Some of you may know his name. He studies the way that words and their interpretations create neural pathways which influence our thoughts and shape our worldviews. You might know his work about what he sees as the differences in worldviews between political conservatives, who he proposes have a strict father type of orientation, and political liberals, who he proposes have what he calls a nurturant families orientation. A Huffington Post article published around the time of the 2016 election caught my eye. In it, he discussed the role of language and messaging in elections and voting decisions, affirming then that politics is more often the art of marketing than the art of debating policies, something we know. And he offered advice for having constructive dialogue about polarizing topics and charged topics. His advice was written to the so-called popular majority in the election, meaning people who did not vote for President Trump. And it seemed to me that his advice transcends political affiliation and time. Lakoff suggests that when we want to counter a statement, we should pay attention to making our point using different and positive language. The first thing, he says, to do is to not repeat the language of the other side or try to negate their framing of the issue. So, for instance, the example he used was not to say our president still wants to build a wall, and that is wrong, but instead to say something like, we welcome immigrants and value diversity, or everyone has the right to seek asylum. So his point is that each repetition of rhetoric, especially hateful or negative rhetoric, even when what we're intending to mount is a rebuttal, those repetitions strengthen that hateful or negative message and normalize that worldview. And that's really not so different, is it, from what good enough parents and teachers do when they refrain from saying, no, stop doing that, and instead say, oh, do this. Instead of stop hitting, saying, use your words. We know that today we must exercise caution and care in the language we use. We do this in order to model and demand the civil and life-affirming discourse we deserve for the common good of our country. I believe we need to exercise that same caution and care in our own faith communities and congregations like this one. And the thing is, though, that reactions to rhetoric and language can go both ways. Sometimes what we perceive to be an affirming or a positive message, a positive concept or worldview, provokes a reaction or pushback from others. For example, if those who are not black say Black Lives Matter, and then they counter with All Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter, not so good. Are our black kin and their allies really being heard and respected and understood? Aren't they just being further marginalized and having their experiences discounted? Similarly, if we are quick to counter our Unitarian Universalist Association leaders who are charging us to, quote, dismantle systemic racism and white supremacy culture, close quote, with our objections over language, are we really hearing and reflecting upon and coming to an understanding of the whole story about racial relations in our country and in our denomination? Are we listening well and with an open mind? Are we getting it? I believe that Unitarian Universalists, and I hope most people, really do want to bring reparation and restitution and reconciliation into our race relations in our communities, in our denomination, in our congregations. And yet, over the past 2 years, I've observed and talked with so many white people like me who have reacted defensively to the language and the concept of white supremacy culture and white privilege. And these are solid sociological concepts, even if we find the language jarring. I know that I did at first. It caught me off guard. I think that part of the resistance to this language and these concepts comes in part from being stuck in a neuro-linguistic loop. We have those deep neural pathways. So for example, if I hear white supremacy and my mind has already associated and leapt to white supremacists, that happens so rapidly and vigorously, and I'm already defending myself, I never hear the word culture. So the phrase is chopped up, and I'm off on a reaction, a knee-jerk reaction. So perhaps that's an unfortunate and triggering choice of words. After all, we do say dismantling systemic racism rather than dismantling racist. And the use of systemic there as a meaning and blunt defensive response, I'm not a racist. So I've been wondering if it might not have been better served, instead of saying dismantling white supremacy, to say dismantling cultural white supremacy, or dismantling a culture of white superiority, or dismantling the cultural superiority of white. And you know, that's the copy editor in me and the wordsmith, parsing a text, right? Aren't we known for wanting to change the words? And that's also me, a white woman with a smidgen of perfectionism, taking other people's works and concepts and perhaps whitewashing them, but definitely trying to make them a little more palatable and manageable. So am I merely taking some of the sting and discomfort out so I can engage in the work? Or am I just trying and struggling to understand things in my own words from my own vantage point? Am I engaging a free and responsible search for truth and meaning? Apparently, I'm not the only one that struggled with this. So in 2017, our UUA Board of Trustees appointed members to a commission called the Commission on Institutional Change, whose charge was to look at long-term cultural and institutional change in our denomination. And it's this group that's been charged with analyzing structural racism and white supremacy in our denomination. It's this group that's challenging us to do this same work. And they will continue doing this work at least through General Assembly 2020, which takes place not this June, but the following June in Providence, Rhode Island. I hope it's on your calendars. It's close. Well, last Friday, a week ago from yesterday, or this past Friday, the Commission released a statement in which it shared some of its observations based on their conversations over the past 18 months. And I want to share some of these excerpts and ask you to kind of hold them in your mind. They wrote, "To some of us, the conversations about white supremacy culture, its reach and impacts are a given that impacts our daily lives. For others, naming white supremacy culture or even the existence of racial bias is an affront, offensive, and may even seem to interrupt the justice work of our association by questioning its goals and values." They continued, "In our congregation, there are those who believe all racial bias has been eliminated within our community and the wider culture. Others hold the opposite belief based on their experience. Racism is real and we are still striving towards justice." They point out that not engaging these differences in perspective with serious considerations as to how they impact members of our community and the world at large makes it harder and harder for us to be in community committed to the responsible search for truth and meaning, when your reality is different than mine and our interpretations butt up against each other. But this failure to engage with one another brings about an indifference toward the suffering brought about by racism. It brings about a lack of needed energy toward promoting the health of our interconnected web of existence, and a lack of commitment towards our shared aspiration of peace, justice, and liberty for all. They point out that the opposite of love is not hate, as the truism goes, it's indifference. And the indifference of some denies the truth of people of color who already are a part of our communities and who desire to share their beliefs and experiences. They conclude by saying that most people do not like conflict in their conversations in general, and conversations about race have started and stopped for just this reason. The biggest danger is not that we will air the differences we already know exist among us. The biggest danger is that we will shut our difficult and dangerous conversations down, and that we will be privileging comfort over growth and choosing the status quo rather than the transformation we so need. So the Commission calls upon congregations to stay engaged in these uncomfortable conversations around racism, and to exercise our spiritual muscle and engage in this work for the present and future of our faith. So we're being asked to stay at the table, and depending on where you are coming from, we're being asked to learn new concepts and learn new language and center the voices and experiences of the marginalized. We're being asked to step from the margins into the leadership, or from the center to the side to become allies and accomplices. We're being asked to align our efforts for the common good. So now I want to ask you to think about transposing some of these observations and comments about dismantling systemic racism and white supremacy culture to how we might address other oppressions that we face. And I am thinking particularly of how we might dismantle our heteronormative and trans-erasing culture, especially in light of the article and the controversy that erupted this past week. An article that was hurtful and inaccurate, erased trans voices by centering a white, straight woman's voice who had good intentions. I think you are very fortunate here to have a series of upcoming workshops on trans inclusion. And this provides a wonderful place for you to do this kind of work communally and collectively with the leadership and encouragement of your dedicated staff and volunteers. And that is a real blessing. In the meantime, I want to invite you to notice where your points of resistance are around words and the use of language. So when you read these articles, and when you read these responses, and when you read the statements, and then when you read the apologies, notice your own reactions. Ask yourself questions like, if I refuse to use a name or the pronoun someone tells me aligns with and affirms their identity, am I really respecting the worth and dignity of every person? Oh, I can't use the singular they, it's just not grammatically correct. Sure you can, get over it. I don't like or I don't understand. I just won't say queer. It meant something different when I was growing up. Okay, come on. Learn more and use it anyway. Beware the danger of slipping into indifference, of denying the truth of trans people who are already part of our communities and denominations. And pay attention if you find yourself wanting to shut down conversations and to discount others' experiences in order to privilege your own comfort over growth. That's a slippery slope. I admit listening and receiving what we hear well is a delicate art. Often it entails differentiating between the intention behind the word the tone of voice and the body language being used, and their impact. Communicating authentically with one another can be challenging, but when we can practice the arts of listening and reflecting, asking clarifying questions, and respecting the context and authenticity of other people's lived truths, then we grow in spiritual depth. We grow in our understanding of ourselves and each other. We become better and stronger together. And in our covenantal communities, like this congregation, it helps that we pledge to stay in dialogue and at the table before, during, and after we speak our truths, and that we expect the same in return. We are human, we are fallible. So we are bound to sometimes have our words hurt someone or to misunderstand each other time and time again. So it helps to be comfortable giving feedback. Ouch, what you said was hurtful. Oops, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. You know, we go to seminary to learn all these things, and I learned this from the youth groups. Ouches and oops. They've got it. And being spiritually grounded helps us to be compassionate rather than condemning, and to be responsive rather than reactive when we're faced with conflict, when we're faced with misunderstanding, when we're faced with the weight of our own shortcomings. I am reminded again and again of the importance of spiritual practices in helping me become less reactive, even if I'm practicing inconsistently. You see, intentionally cultivating spiritual practices was not something I grew up with. I remember my Methodist upbringing being mostly consumed with dissecting the language and the theology I was hearing around me, trying to make sense of it. At that time, I lacked the exposure or the resources to reinterpret this very literal biblical language in more metaphorical and expansive ways. I'd never heard about myths, except Greek myths. You might say that hearing and reading the words of the King James translation of the Bible over and over and over had grooved some very deep neural pathways already. And it wasn't until I was in one of my seminary classes that I could really begin to wrestle with this language and meaning, when I committed to the contemplative Benedictine Christian practices of centering prayer and Lectio Divina. Some of you may know these. Centering prayer is a Christian concept, and it's an undirected prayer of receptivity, a sort of wait and see. Some say it has even a Zen-like meditative quality. And Lectio Divina, which is Latin for divine reading, is the reading and meditating and praying and contemplating of a passage of writing, usually a scripture. And so in this class, the professor was giving out the biblical readings for this exercise from the book of Psalms, and she was accustomed to having Unitarian Universalist students in her classes, so she said, you can just use a Mary Oliver poem. Ouch. Ouch. I mean, I appreciated her understanding that we draw from many sources, but ouch. So I took offense, and so then I would challenge, probably out of spite, to re-engage with the very biblical language and theological concepts I had once rejected. And I found that as I began studying the contextual details of historical settings and cultures and authors' motives and various translations, I gained a new and still evolving, much broader appreciation of the Bible. Now, my point here is not to insist that you should all take up this practice, although I can see how it would be useful, but to reinforce that intentionally engaging with language or concepts or other people's experiences that seem foreign to us can bring new learning, new insight, and an appreciation for the breadth of human experience. It takes work and study and practice to learn new vocabulary and new frameworks. It takes concerted effort and repetition, to become comfortable using new terms and concepts, and to be comfortable learning how to ask different and more constructive questions. It takes effort, repetition, and time to reprogram those neural pathways. And so, as the days and the weeks and the months stretch out before us, let us resolve to practice seeking words that invite fuller understanding and peacemaking, to speak our truth authentically with no need or impulse to condemn others, and to bear witness to and celebrate the different expressions of our common humanity. Above all, let us be mindful as Unitarian Universalists that rhetoric of hate and oppression is not ours to repeat, because ours is a progressive and life-affirming language to speak. So preach and share the good news of our values, our principles, and our actions. Preach the good news of this safe space where you and we can stay at the table for honest and difficult conversations. Preach the good news of spiritual practices of seeking and speaking words of peace to ourselves and to each other. Because as Robbie Walsh said, every word, every deed is making the meaning of our life and telling the story of the world and our faith. May we be well chosen. May it be so. I invite you to rise in body and spirit and join in our closing song number 1054.